All right, so today we're going to pick up talking about drugs, specifically psychoactive drugs, which are chemicals introduced into the body which alter perceptions, mood, and other elements of conscious experience. So we're going to focus in on the kind of illegal type drugs, not necessarily kind of the legal ones or the ones that are used in therapeutic methods. We'll come back to those when we talk about therapy methods. So, some of the big psychological factors with drugs is, dependence and addiction. So, many psychoactive drugs can be harmful to the body, and psychoactive drugs are particularly dangerous when a person develops an addiction or becomes dependent on the substance. So, what are some of the factors related to addiction? Well, tolerance, withdrawal, impact on daily life and substance use, and physical and psychological dependence. So when we talk about dependence, okay, we have both physical dependence and psychological dependence. In physical dependence, the body has been altered in ways that create cravings for the drugs. So for instance, you start to get withdrawal symptoms. In psychological dependence, a person's resources for coping with life, daily life becomes daily with it as the drug becomes needed to relax, socialize, sleep, and those wells. So when we talk about dependence, we don't just, we kind of talk about it in a twofold way, both in the physical sense and also the psychological sense. And, there is debate sometimes about which one is harder to break, the physical dependence on a drug or the psychological dependence. Now, when you depend on a substance or an activity, some of the terminology that we use, tolerance, this is the need to use more to receive the desired effect. Okay, withdrawal, which is the distress experience when the high subsides, um, using more than intended, persistent failed attempts to regulate use, and much time spent preoccupied with the substance, obtaining it and recovering, and important activities reduced because of the use. Okay, so when we're talking about this idea of dependence, we can see that it's kind of a whole being dependence, not just, we don't just focus in on the neurotransmitters, the biology of it, we focus also in on the behavioral aspects that go along with it, because sometimes the behavioral aspects, the psychological pieces, are more powerful and become more addictive than necessarily just the physical properties of the substance themselves. And the continued use despite adversive consequences. This is a big one. And it kind of goes back to that, when we talk about the rewards and stuff like that. Well, we know that we're fairly dependent on something when the rewards are gone and we start to have kind of the adversive consequences. So, what are some of the major categories? Well, depressants is the first category, okay? And depressants are chemicals that reduce neural activity and other body functions. So, examples of that are alcohol, barbiturates, and opiates. Okay, so what are some of the effects on alcohol use? Well, the impact on functioning is that it slows neural processing. Okay, everything in our body slows down. Now, despite popular belief, alcohol is a depressant. Yes, you do get that initial kind of, it feels like people are a buzz, like a buzz of energy, and they do all these things, and that actually has to do more with the psychological components we'll talk about. So, the reduced memory formation caused by disrupted REM sleep and reduced synapse formation, and also impaired self-control, impaired judgment, self-monitoring, inhibition, increase in accidents, and aggression. So one of the reasons why people forget that alcohol is a depressant is because one of the first things that goes is this impaired self-control, which makes people sometimes come out of their shell, do things that they wouldn't normally do, which does make it seem like it's kind of a stimulant, but actually, when you look at the effects that it's having on your body, the reason why you do those things is because your brain isn't working fast enough to say, this is not a good idea. Okay, so if we take a look at this charts over here, what we can notice is that the changes in the brain with alcoholism. So this top scan is the scan of a woman without alcoholism. Okay, this bottom one is a scan of a woman with alcoholism. So what do we notice? Well, we notice that there is a profound shrinkage in brain tissue. There's an increased ventricle in the center, okay, which is not a good thing because I think if you remember, I don't know if we've talked about this, but this is actually something we also see in schizophrenia. Okay, and you can see like the fluid-filled cavities that increase of just like blank space in the brain. So it really does start to deteriorate your brain, and chronic use does cause brain damage. All right, barbiturates is the next category. These are tranquilizers, drugs that depress the central nervous system activity. So remember, the central nervous system, brain, spinal cord. So what barbiturates do is they slow everything down. Okay, so some examples of these are nambutol, seconal, and amytal. Okay, the effects, they reduce anxiety and they induce sleep. Okay, problems with barbiturates are reducing memory, judgment, and concentration, and can lead to death if combined with alcohol. Because remember, alcohol is a depressant. Barbiturates are also types of depressants, but they're more tranquilizing. So if your central nervous system gets depressed too greatly, then you stop breathing, your heart starts pumping, all of those messages kind of just don't get relayed anymore. And opiates. Opiates are highly addictive depressants. Okay, opiates are chemicals such as morphine and heroin that are made from the opium poppy. Opiates depress the nervous system activity. This reduces anxiety and especially reduces pain. Now, there are some legal types of opiates. A lot of our pain medication, especially prescription pain medication, is opiate derived. Okay, and it is in small, controlled doses of certain types of opiates. They are very effective pain medicines. However, the problem is that illegal opiates usually are not monitored closely, and the dosages are not there to prevent addiction. So, high doses of opiates produce euphoria. Opiates work at the receptor sites for the body's neural pain receptors, the endorphins. Okay, now stimulants, the next category, are drugs which intensify neural activity and bodily functions. Some physical effects of stimulants include dilated pupils, increased breathing and heart rate, increased blood sugar, and decreased appetite. So the examples of stimulants are things like coffee, nicotine, amphetamines, methamphetamines, cocaine, and ecstasy. Now, caffeine. We all love our caffeine. Okay, it adds energy, but it also disrupts sleep for 3 or 4 hours, can lead to withdrawal symptoms if used daily. Things such as headaches, irritability, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and depression. Now, there's debate about how much caffeine that you actually need for these types of things to occur, and we'll talk in more detail about some of this stuff in class. Now, nicotine, the main effect of nicotine use is addiction. Okay, so we know that it arouses the brain to an increased state of alertness. It increases heart rate and blood pressure. At high levels, it relaxes muscles and triggers the release of neurotransmitters that may reduce stress, and it suppresses the appetite for carbohydrates. Okay, and it reduces circulation to the extremities. So nicotine is an interesting one because, the main effect of nicotine use is addiction, but it also is a stimulant as well. Now, why do people smoke? Well, they start smoking because of peer influence culture and media, continuing because they're positively enforced by physically stimulating effects, and not stopping after regular use. Smokers have difficulty stopping because of withdrawal symptoms such as insomnia, anxiety, irritability, and distractibility. All right, cocaine. Cocaine blocks reuptake. Remember, reuptake is after the neurotransmitters, it comes back up. Okay, and thus increases levels at the synapse of dopamine, which is a rewarding feeling, serotonin, which lifts mood, and norepinephrine, which provides energy. The effect on consciousness is euphoria for at least 45 minutes. Now, what happens next, though? Well, the euphoria crashes into a state worse than before taking the drug, with agitation, depression, and pain. So, users, though, also begin to develop a tolerance. So, over time, withdrawal symptoms of cocaine get worse, and users need to take more in order just to feel normal. Notice that it's not to feel high, just to feel normal. And the cycles of overdose and withdrawal can sometimes bring convulsions, violence, heart attack, and death. What about methamphetamines? Well, they trigger the sustained release of dopamine, sometimes leading to 8 hours of euphoria and energy. What happens next? Irritability, insomnia, seizures, hypertension, violence, and depression. Meth addiction can become all-consuming. So here's a picture of a woman from 2008 to 2002. Same woman somebody who is addicted to meth. And in class, we're going to take a really close look at methamphetamines, as well as some other drugs that are that are related to methamphetamines and some of the effects that it could have. All right, ecstasy or MDMA. It's a synthetic stimulant that increases dopamine and greatly increases serotonin. Okay, the effects on consciousness are euphoria, central nervous system stimulation, hallucinations, and artificial feeling of social connectedness and intimacy. Now, what happens next with ecstasy? In the short run, regretted behavior, dehydration, overheating, and high blood pressure. Because it is a stimulant, it's going to speed us up. And the problem is most of the time when people take ecstasy, they're at clubs, they're in warm places, and they're dancing, they're sweating, they're doing all of those things. And so because your body is already dehydrated and overheated and has high blood pressure, coupling that with the environmental factors is one of the reasons why it makes it incredibly dangerous. Now, if you make it past that, you might have damaged serotonin producing neurons that cause a permanently depressed mood. One of the biggest factors, long-term factors of ecstasy use is actually depression because it changes your body's ability to produce serotonin, which causes your mood to become permanently depressed. It can disrupt your sleep and circadian rhythms, okay, impaired memory and slowed thinking, and suppressed immune system. So it does have some kind of some long-term effects that can be very kind of detrimental. Now, what about hallucinogenics, our last category here? In hallucinogenics, things like LSD and similar drugs interfere with serotonin transmission. This causes hallucinations, images and other sensations that didn't come in through the senses. So it's kind of like your brain is seeing things that aren't really there, feeling things, hearing things, any of your senses. Okay, so marijuana is a hallucinogenic. Okay, it binds with the brain cannabinoid receptors. Okay, and the effect on consciousness is it amplifies sensations, it disinhibits impulses, it causes an euphoric mood, and lack of ability to sense satiety, which is kind of overeating. Now, with marijuana, what happens next? Well, there's impaired motor coordination, perceptual ability, and reaction time. THC accumulates in the body, increasing the effects of the next use. And over time, the brain shrinks in areas processing memory and emotion. There's smoke inhalation damage and smoke inhalation damage. Okay, so in class I'll show you some brain scans of this because I know marijuana is a very hotly debated topic about whether or not it should be classified as an illegal substance or not. All right, so what are the ones that you need to know? Okay, so here is a guide to the drugs that you should be familiar with, the psychoactives you should be familiar with, what is their classification, and then also what are their pleasurable and adverse effects. Okay, so alcohol, heroin, caffeine, methamphetamines, cocaine, nicotine, MDMA, and marijuana. Okay, these are the ones that most often you're going to see show up on either the test or in a free response. All right, prevalence of drug use in the United States. Well, we do know that, you guys all love those California Healthy Kids surveys. This is where a lot of this data comes from. This is the number of high school seniors reporting drug use. And what we have found is that overall, we do see that drug use is on the decrease, which is a good thing. Now, what are some of the influences that can lead to drug use? Well, we have biological influences, genetic predispositions, variations in neurotransmitter systems. That's why some people get addicted quicker, some people have a higher and lower natural tolerance. A lot of that is based off of biology. We have the psychological influences, lacking sense of purpose, stress, disorders, and those kinds of things. And then sociocultural influences, urban environment, cultural attitude towards drug use, and peer influences. Now, what can turn drug use into dependence? Okay, the biological factors, dependence in relatives, thrill seeking in childhood, genes related to alcohol sensitivity and dependence, and easily disrupted dopamine reward system. So thrill seekers, especially are a biological factor because remember when we talked about the brain and we talked about thrill seeking behaviors and why some of us have a higher threshold for thrill and some of us have a lower threshold. Well, people that have a higher threshold for thrill-seeking behaviors also are going to have a higher threshold for drug use, which means they're going to have to use it more to get the same feeling, which is going to cause an increased risk factor of dependence. Then there's the psychological factors, seeking gratification, depression, problems forming identity, problems assessing risks and costs, and social influence, media glorification, and observing peers. All right, so in class we're going to talk a lot more in details about about the drugs, about how what some of the effects are. I have some really interesting brain scans and